Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
It's our 100th episode, and to celebrate, we're doing a Meet the Podcasters special. As regular listeners will know, generally, we're all about the books. But today, we thought we'd throw it open to questions and let our listeners know a little more about us.
We've got questions from our book clubs, questions from our Instagram friends, and from listeners far and wide, and we're so looking forward to answering them. For everything from the first books we ever loved to the book we'd most disagreed on, listen in.
Of course, we're not going to be able to resist weaving in some book recommendations, so listen in for our favourites and, as ever, the ones to avoid.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. Is this opening night of the proms, Kate?
That, Laura, is the fanfare for our 100th episode.
When we started out, could you have possibly imagined we would actually record 100 episodes?
Well, it's funny because now we've got here, it feels very natural to me, like inevitable. You might even say that at some point we were going to get to 100 episodes. But no, I mean, you know, when we first started, just launching that first one, even that felt pretty impossible. We've had some really nice milestones this week. This is our 100th episode. We've just passed 3,000 followers on Instagram, and we've passed 200,000 downloads on the Libsyn pod download stats.
That's quite good.
Which I only check about 8 times a day. We have got all these lovely questions to answer, so let's get on with it.
100 questions?
No, less than that.
Okay. That's good. No one would keep listening.
Let's be uncharacteristic and try and keep it brief.
Okay, all right. I'll hold my hand and wave at you when you need to stop.
Matt Blackstock on Instagram asked if we were both avid readers when we were growing up. Were you an avid reader growing up?
Yes, I certainly was. What about you?
I was, but I was thinking I didn't really grow up in a house that was full of books because my parents were just super busy. You know, my dad was a farmer, my mum was a primary school teacher. They just didn't ever have time to read. So I'm not quite sure. I was thinking about it and I couldn't quite work out where my books came from. I remember my grandmother's brother, my great uncle, died, and I inherited quite a lot of books from his collection. Things like the Jungle Book and these sort of old like colonial editions of things. I was just a huge rereader of everything. If I found something I liked, I would just read them again and again and again. I had a little look around the shed, actually. A corner of my bookshelf has the various childhood books that I've hung on to, I guess through some vague notion of handing them on to my own children. I've got the Jungle Book, the second Jungle Book, which is Mowgli's continuing adventures in the jungle where he's sort of grown up and is basically in charge. And I love that even more than the Jungle Book. The Chalet School, Elinor and Brent, Dyer. Did you read those? I read all of those.
No.
I love those so much. They're set in a Swiss school, you know, kind of international school. And I love them so much. I used to beg my parents to send me to a Swiss boarding school, which clearly was totally out of the question, but that was my great thing. I've got an ancient copy of The Wind in the Willows, Noel Streatfeild, White Boots.
Oh, yeah.
I remember I love Little Women. I've got this hilarious, can you see that cover? It's a Dean's
yeah, that's quite something.
Edition. Very, very of its day. That's what I got here. Rumer, Godden, Miss Happiness, Miss Flower, and Little Plum. We've talked about. You love those.
I know
too,
that one.
In case any listeners didn't hear that episode, which is quite likely, Laura actually had someone made her the doll's house, the Japanese doll's house that is the focal point of the story of Miss Happiness and Miss Flower.
It wasn't made for me. It was actually made for my aunt, but then as her niece, I would play with it with my cousin.
I've got Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh.
I do know that one. I mean, you're bringing back lots of memories for sure.
I love that so much. We're going to come back to this later because there's a question later on about books that made you cry and I couldn't think of anything, but now I found this. Justin. I've got a Louis L'Amour book, Dark Canyon. Are you familiar with Louis L'Amour?
No.
How could you not? You're like North American. How could you not know Louis L'Amour? He wrote these westerns.
Well, that's why.
You know, we're a bit obsessed with Georgette Heyer and romance novels for women. Well, this is kind of like the male equivalent, I feel. He wrote these westerns usually like lonesome, handsome men. There's some kind of usual setup with local bandits or whatever, and there's always a love interest. And at the end, usually it all works out. And he wrote about 1,000 of them. My dad really liked them. So I read all of those. I read all my dad's books. So I read all of these, and I read his entire collection of Dick Francis books as well. And then I've got a couple of horsey books here. I've got Patricia Leitch, A Devil to Ride. Are you into horsey books at all?
No, never into horses. Still, fun fact about me, I have never ridden a horse, ever.
So my sister and I got deeply, deeply, deeply into pony books. The Pullin-Thompson sisters books, again, about 1,000 books about pony clubs, and we just devoured those. And then Patricia Leitch wrote this whole series about this girl, Ginny, and her Arab horse. There was something always a bit wild about them that I really loved. They were set in remote Scotland, and they were just so evocative and atmospheric. I love them. And then there's a book called Cobbler's Dream by Monica Dickens that I really, really loved. And I found out recently something I had never known, which was that Monica Dickens is the great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens. Which it doesn't mention that on the back, which I like. I feel like now they would surely trumpet that fact. But it doesn't make any mention of that anywhere as far as I could see in the blurb of this book. But yeah, I used to really love it. So anyway, as you can tell, I've just been very happily wallowing in nostalgia here.
Well, I have a few books that come to mind, and more as you've been speaking. Did you ever read Diana Wynne Jones?
Howl's Moving Castle?
So yeah, Howl's Moving Castle is the most famous one because it was made into a film. But she wrote these other series, and I have just been trying to find the names of the books. And I think I've done this in the past too, because I loved them so much. And they were almost like a precursor to Harry Potter. And your point about boarding school reminded me of that. The story, as I recall it, was about a young child, unceremoniously being like picked up and taken off to a magical boarding school. So I remember when Harry Potter came along a few years later, I was like, oh, well, this is familiar ground. This isn't that surprising. The Dark is Rising sequence also came to mind.
Oh, yes, that's in my pile. I skipped that one.
Good stuff.
Love
Good
those.
stuff. Sticking with the, contemporary fantasy.
And I reread that recently, and they so hold up. They so hold up, those books. You should do the same.
Is making me want to do it. Yeah. Well, I was just thinking that when I was looking at Diana Wynne Jones, I was like, I need to find this book and just reread it. Why wouldn't I? This is what we want right now, is comfort reading. I mean, at least I still do.
Well, The Dark is Rising is actually really scary, so I wouldn't say it's particularly comfort reading.
Okay, all right.
But amazing, though.
Noel Strutfield, I loved ballet shoes and had a very brief ballet career. And I was about, I was probably about 10, and I was terrible. Anyway, I was not set for the stage in that respect anyway. There was also one, I think it was called Hollywood Shoes. They were all great fun and so full of wish fulfillment, I think, for a young girl. Loved them.
Yeah, because White Boots is about ice skating. And I also had, I can't have been theatre shoes, but, the one about the theatre. Which also just loved and read and reread.
And then I was thinking about transitional books, the books I read as a child, but were adult books. And that includes To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I remember my dad gave that to me probably when I was about 12.
Oh, wow.
And I read it, but when you're a child and you just can't quite understand, for example, like sex scenes or like violent scenes even, it's almost like your worldview isn't big enough. So I remember reading To Kill a Mockingbird then and not really getting it, and then reading it much later and being like, oh, okay, completely different experience. And finally, the book that probably most impacted me as a child, I think for worse, was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, because it's set up. Yeah, I loved it. I read it, I think, again, probably at 12, right before, heading into high school. And it just turned me into a hopeless romantic with unrealistic expectations of what teenage boys would bring to our future relationships.
Wow, that seems quite young to me to be reading To Kill a Mockingbird and Pride and Prejudice. I didn't have any experiences like that. I was thinking what I think was the sort of gateway book for me was The Lord of the Rings, which I read when I was 13. We were on holiday in Switzerland, and it was the only English language book in the hotel. And so I duly picked it up and started it. And I remember just read it over the course of that week. My mind was totally blown. And that, I think, is what then started me off really loving fantasy. But before that, I hadn't really read anything particularly grown up, I don't think.
All right. We have been quite exhaustive.
Yeah, exactly. We could clearly talk about this for hours and should do in our own time.
In our own time. What is the next question?
So much for being succinct. I can't believe it. On Instagram, Beatrice Troyanopolo, and Messy Aussie Reader, who is my friend Sarah, want to know how we met. You'll have to tell this story because we both worked together at a publishing company here in London called Thames and Hudson, who are reasonably well known. I think big, beautiful coffee table art books. But I've got a memory like a goldfish. I can't actually remember how we actually met. Presumably it was like in the kitchen making tea or something.
No, I don't remember that either. Listen, I don't even know if we properly met until I was invited to your book club by my boss at the time and our mutual friend Amanda. And so I think probably I'd seen you around because you weren't there full time. You were a freelance designer, so you would pop in and out. And Amanda must have flagged me and put me on your radar, and you said, yeah, sure, she can come. And so I visited you when your second daughter was 3 weeks old, maybe. And you hosted book club in the basement of this rented house you had in North London at the time. Do you remember this?
Nope.
Okay.
I really do. I'm very interested in this story.
And we read Night Flight by Antoine Saint-Exupéry.
Okay.
The reason you probably don't remember it is because you had a 3-week-old baby like smudged on your chest.
Yeah, but I remember the book. I do remember the book, which I remember loving.
And I remember being very daunted because Kate takes notes at her book club and you have to go around in a circle and say what you thought. And I didn't know these people. Most of them I didn't know at all. Didn't know Kate. And yeah, it was a bit alarming. But then, of course, we just became friends because often you would drive me home from book club and we would just natter away. We'd like park up and like teenagers just keep talking for another half hour. And hence, we decided to create a podcast where we could do that on a regular basis.
It's the next logical stage, isn't it?
Force everyone else to listen to us.
Yeah, exactly. This probably happens in all friendships now. It's like, you get on, you want to have conversation. Oh, we should definitely start a podcast. So that leads very nicely into Maria's question in my book club, who just wanted to know how we came up with the idea for the podcast and was the format set easily, she says, music, the introduction, etc.
Well, do you remember it started as a book, actually?
Oh.
And we had this idea that we might create a very giftable, small, beautiful book about starting a book club, what you should do, maybe some activities, some exercises. And I think we had one meeting about it and then we never followed up with it.
I still
and we
like
realized
that plan.
I mean, it would make sense. We have a whole podcast that we could mine for content. But the reality was, again, we just wanted to talk to each other. We didn't want to like go away and have to do lots of work.
Yeah.
And so I think the idea for a podcast came about, and you have some insider knowledge in your family and some recording equipment. So we had some tutorials from your husband and took it from there.
Yeah, he is a professional broadcaster and takes it all very seriously. So as a result, from the very beginning, I was expected to meet certain standards in terms of editing and sort of sound production and, all of this kind of stuff. But I think that's good. I think those things are important too, actually. I'm a great believer in a good edit.
Which is how we ended up with a structure that then became a series of episodes. If you recall, our first few episodes so they had a book club discussion where we reported back on what our book clubs had made about each of their books. That's right, we talked about 2 books in one episode.
Yep.
And then we gave book recommendations inspired by those books. And then after the closing credits, we would have a natter about our latest books. And those episodes became very long and unwieldy. I think about after 10 episodes or so, we split them up. So now we have our book club episodes, now we have our bookshelf episodes, and then we have our interviews. Oh, that's right. Of course, there were the interviews embedded in there as well. There was a lot in there.
I mean, you say they're long, but they're not significantly longer than the episodes we do now. I remember at the time, I was pretty ruthless about cutting them. So there's a lot packed into a 45-minute show. And they're all still there in our archive. I occasionally will go back and dip into a really early episode, and I think they're absolutely fine. I think they totally stand up. I like them, actually. But they were an absolute ton of work. They really, really were. And we couldn't do one of those a week, that's the thing, or one every 2 weeks. It was too much.
And that's actually probably credit to your long-suffering husband, because he sat in on our first 3 or 4 episodes.
I'd forgotten that. Did he?
Yeah, he did. And he would stop us. He would be really scary. He'd be like, stop, say it again. Kate, stop making mouth noises. Laura, stop moving your hand on your mic.
Oh my God, that's
was terrifying.
Back to me. I had completely forgotten. Well, I mean, I have to, this is what I have to put up with all the time. Every time I show him anything, he's like, can't you just see it needs to be like this? And it's very irritating because even though he's not a reader and read about 3 books in his entire life, if I'm trying to do something and I run it by him, I'm like, oh look, I'm just trying to write this intro. This is what I've written, and I'll read it out, and he'll just like, oh, for goodness sake, Just say this, 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 and this. And he'll absolutely have nailed it. He'll have said everything that's important and pertinent. And he doesn't know anything about it at all. But what he knows is how to kind of like just package things up really brilliantly.
We owe him a great debt.
We really do, actually. He is the total unsung hero of the podcast. That is a very fair thing to admit at this point. And yes, so big shout out to him. He doesn't listen to them, so he won't ever hear this. I don't think he's ever listened to a whole episode. He'd just be
Probably
like,
not.
That's 50 minutes of my life I'm never going to get back.
My husband used to listen to them because he worked long hours, and he'd be like, oh, it's just nice to spend some time with you. Oh, such romance.
I did just want to say about the music, only because a listener once asked me on Instagram where it came from. It's the memorably named Sprightly. It's from a music library called Audio Network by Alex Arcolio, Arcoleo, Arcolio maybe, Alex Arcolio. And I was curious just because it made me think, well, where does that music come from? So I looked it up. Apparently he's from Guildford. He taught himself to play the piano and compose. His electronic music is led by melody, not percussion, which lends it its depth and humanity. He counts among his influences bonobo and continues to develop a unique oral identity. But what I like about that music is I was worried when I picked it, 4 years ago, that I would get sick of it. You know, I had a little short list of options, and I remember I ran it by a friend of mine at Thames and Hudson, actually. He's a designer there, but on the side, he's a brilliant musician and composer, and he makes this kind of music, like background music for adverts and things. I remember I emailed it to him, and I was like, we're thinking about using this for this show that we're going to do. What do you think? Is it going to drive me nuts after, 3 months or something? And he listened to and he was like, I think this one is the one. I always think he was so right. I have never got sick of it. To this day, I quite like listening to it, and I listen to it a lot. I really listen to it a lot. So Nick Jenkins, it's thanks to him that we picked that music and that it doesn't annoy me to this day.
I didn't know that story. Okay, lovely Natalie from your book club, who I know, wants to know, how do we record the podcast? And is this verbatim, maintain such a lovely natural style when one of you is in Canada and the other in London?
Yes, I put that question in because I just thought that was so sweet of her to say that. Thank you, Natalie. It's a complete hassle. We each record our own audio with our own microphone and our own digital recorders. So we're doing it outside of our computer. We're using the computer to see each other here on Zoom. And then Laura will send me her audio file at the end. And I then mix the two separate tracks together. And I try and, iron out any bits where we're talking over each other, and then just do all the usual taking out of mistakes and all of that. The bits where we have to look things up. And hopefully, if I've done it well enough, it should sound seamless.
I think it does sound seamless. And also, though, just the natural style thing. It's weird because when we get into this mode, I just feel like we're in the same room. I think it comes from having spent so much time together over the years that actually the screen just kind of disappears.
I feel that at the same time as I feel that you're a long way away in Canada.
Oh, on the West Coast, no less. Okay, so Sarah at Bessie Aussie Reader on Instagram also wants to know how we find time to record and promote the show. Well, it's currently my lunch hour.
Yeah. I mean, recording's fine, isn't it? We fit it in, and then editing.
Kate slaves away for hours.
Yeah, takes up quite a lot of my time. It's the promotion that is quite hard. And it's frustrating because, making the show is kind of the easy part. Actually then trying to surface it and so that people actually know it's there and people can find it is really hard because, I think when we were first starting naively, you sort of think, oh, great, we'll put this podcast on iTunes. It's on iTunes. Everyone will find it. And of course, that's not the case at all. Apple doesn't do anything to show your podcast. And in fact, it used to drive me absolutely wild that for a long time, you could sort of search to filter. But if you put in books, it didn't come up, I think. It used to drive me absolutely nuts. It's like it has the word book in the title. All we do is talk about books. Why isn't it coming up when people put in books? So little things like that, gradually it dawns on you. It's quite hard for people to discover your show. We decided quite early on, didn't we, that we would focus on Instagram. We didn't have a website back then, so we were focused on Instagram because it felt like, because I was a designer, we're both quite visual people, it just felt like a really natural fit. I think the lovely thing about that has been the way that gradually over time, people kind of complain about social media being sort of, I don't know, it could be unpleasant or having a really negative influence on your life. But my impression of my Bookstagram corner and the people that I interact with on there is it's just such a lovely world. They're all so nice.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I learn so much from all of them. And I'm always so interested to see what people are reading, what they're posting about, and people write so thoughtfully. And that's been a real joy. So anyway, that's just inadvertent. You know, the point of being on there originally was to try and figure out ways to let people know about the show. But in and of itself, it's become something that has come to mean quite a lot to me. I really enjoy it.
Mm.
But yeah, promotion.
You also enjoy it as a creative endeavor. Kate thrives on novelty, creative novelty. So we have a new Instagram series coming out soon, folks.
So
that Kate was confessing she dreamt up.
Laura marooned herself on what was the name of the island? Some island off the coast of Vancouver.
Bowen Island, yeah.
Bowen Island
during the heat wave.
So she texted me quite early on to say, "There's no Wi-Fi here. I can't." We were supposed to record and we couldn't. That's why this episode is a little bit late. And then I just didn't really hear much from her the whole week. And I was left to my own devices. I didn't have a show to work on. I didn't have anything really going on. And so, yeah, I just broke it to Laura earlier that I basically come up with a whole new Instagram video series that I basically recorded the first episode and we're ready to launch.
We're very complimentary. My contribution to promotion was corralling Kate into creating our website when I was on maternity leave a while back now. And just saying, this is what we're going to do with my maternity leave. When the baby naps, we're going to work on this. And now the baby's in daycare one day a week. We're going to work on this. And Kate was like, oh no, it's going to be so much work. I was like, yes, let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it is now there. Bookclubreview.co.uk.
Got to feed the beast. That's the trouble with websites.
Got to feed that beast.
Yeah.
Okay.
We should do more to feed it really than we do. At the very least, we should publish that fantasy books article.
Oh gosh, those are fantasy books articles.
It's really good. It's just been sitting in the drafts folder for about just over 2 months now because Laura needs to write something about a Guy Gavriel Kay book that I've never read, so I can't write it for her. And then it's going to go. Then it's going to be good to go.
All right. Okay. Changing gears, I think we are going to move on to what was a book that category. And to kick that off, we have a question from Ishini. Ishini Kills Joy on Instagram. What was a book that one of you loved and the other disliked thoroughly?
I'm sure she doesn't kill joy. She seems like a very lovely person whenever I interact with her on Instagram. And Andy H. also in my book club wanted to know about books or genres we fundamentally disagree on.
I don't think there are any.
No, I agree with that. I couldn't think of anything. You might argue that we like different types of fantasy, and I feel like when you've recommended things to me open-heartedly, they haven't really struck home with me, and vice versa, I think, which is just slightly disappointing for both of us, isn't it? But fantasy's such a personal thing.
I always think that comes from recommendations that we've made about books that meant something to us.
Yeah,
I think in our teen years.
Yeah, probably.
And so we're bringing something different.
But you know, Robin Hobb, your Robin Hobb obsession, and I tried to read a Robin Hobb.
That's my teenage.
I just don't know what she sees in these.
That's a teenage love. That's what I see.
I also was thinking, I feel like there was a time when you didn't read as much non-fiction. And that was...
It is true.
But these days, I feel like you maybe read more, or it doesn't seem like a thing to me that you only read fiction.
I think I only choose fiction for myself, but if my book club reads non-fiction, you know.
You read it quite happily.
Go for it.
Yeah.
It depends what it is.
With me, it's absolutely equal pleasure. I don't really distinguish between the two.
But what was a book that you loved and the other disliked thoroughly? I have a surprise.
Okay. Well, let's get through mine then, because mine are not a surprise, because I was thinking this is so easy. There are episodes of the podcast that document thoroughly our disagreements. So the most obvious one would be The Prophets of Eternal Fjord, which is a book that won... Did it win? I don't think it won, actually, but it was nominated for the International Dublin Literary Prize, which is the prize where all the books are nominated by librarians around the world. I love it. I think it's such a great idea for a prize. And this was by a Danish writer, is he? I think.
Yes, I think that's right. Yep.
I'm trying to think of his name. Oh, Kim Liner. That's right, Kim Liner. And, or Lena, however you say his name. A historical novel. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I loved the way it was dark and beautifully detailed. I really believed in all the characters. It was touching on the Danish colonial legacy with Greenland, which I thought gave it a really interesting, wider historical resonance that I thought then brought it up to the present day that was really interesting. Yeah, I just loved it. I thought it was very unexpected and I was really moved by it. But you really didn't like it, did you?
I was quite... in that episode, and I still have this memory, there's just a lot of bodily functions, and I remember in that episode going squelch and squirch and you know, it just, ugh. It was a
life.
very, very realistic depiction of life and sex and violence in Greenland in, what was it, the 18th century?
Yeah, I think so. Because he's
God.
sent there as a missionary. I think at one point he does end up having to eat his own shoe, doesn't he? Or it's that kind of thing.
Oh, probably. Yeah. No, and it's huge. It's like 500, 600 pages.
It's quite long.
It just keeps going and going and going.
I would concede, I think perhaps it was a bit longer than it needed to be. I think the last sort of fifth could have gone quite happily. Another one I wrote down was, more recently, Mrs. Death by Selina Godden, which,
true.
Strangely I ended up loving, and you never really got beyond the I'm finding this difficult and challenging phase.
Exactly. Although I do now own a beautiful copy that you sent to me from London. So it's possible one day I will read it. I had read it on my phone, on my Kindle app, and I would be the first person to say that is very unfair for a novel of that type, where it's all poetry, really.
So that was episode 94. The Prophets episode was episode 6. And I was also remembering that we disagreed about how much to revere Sally Rooney in episode 35.
All right. Well, this is new to you, and you might cry, and it might derail the whole episode as you defend this book.
What are you going to say?
I thought The Moth in the Mountain was very overrated and really quite dull.
Overrated by me, because I just raved about it so much.
Exactly. However, having just brought it up on my screen, the quotes from a variety of newspaper outlets are effusive. An outstanding book, the Wall Street Journal. Gripping at every turn, outside. A gem of a book, the Guardian. A hell of a ride, the Times. No, Kate. It should be good, but I just found the writing really, really leaden.
Did you? Leaden?
Ed Caesar, you're lovely. Don't listen to us.
Oh my goodness.
And I recommended it to my dad, and he said, so this book, what did you think of it? And I was like, oh no, I didn't get on with it at all, but I kind of wanted to find out what you thought. He's like, oh, I'm only like 25% of the way in. Do I have to finish it? And I was like, no. I was like, well, the only part I really loved was the airplane trip. Sorry, context.
I was about to say, what did he think of the plane journey? I mean, come on.
The plane journey. So this is, reading from the caption, this is the extraordinary true story about one man's attempt to solve the wounds of war and save his own soul through an audacious adventure. It's the story of World War I veteran Maurice Wilson, who conceives a crazy, beautiful plan. He will fly a plane from England to Everest, crash land on its lower slopes, and become the first person to reach its summit, utterly alone. And that sounds amazing. And you know, I love this time period. I love adventurer novels. The Snow Leopard, one of our early episodes, is one of my favorite books that we've discussed. So this is like the sweet spot for me in terms of a book. Just thought it was really poorly done.
How interesting, but I'm wondering, because it's not really an adventure story. I think it's a story about someone who, for the reasons that he goes into in quite
I thought it was reaching. I thought it was reaching. I thought that
he conceived of this crazy adventure, but he wasn't really that rational about it. And I thought, as a story of someone whose mental health was not great, I think he paints a really convincing picture of his state of mind. This crazy life, and that to me as then a sort of token of the whole generation of men whose lives were destroyed. For me, it was so poignant. Someone who had survived the war. You know, he'd had a good war. He'd fought incredibly bravely. He'd been decorated. He had a medal. He had been wounded and then shipped out. That's about as good a war experience as you could get, in that he survived and lived to tell the tale and was able to then live the rest of his life. But I thought what Ed Caesar drew out so beautifully, and for me very movingly, was the fact that even men who survived the war didn't really. I thought it was a wonderfully complex book. I'm so surprised that, you know, obviously I think I just read it maybe in a very different way, but that just makes me think, Laura, that it would be a very good book club book. Because I wasn't sure, because I loved it so much. I was like, well, maybe this won't work because everyone will just think it's so great. But actually, other views are available.
But this is not an episode about the Moth at the Mountain. Are we going to get to our quick answers?
No.
She sets these things up. She's like, we need to be efficient.
I know, that's right.
She gets excited. What was a book that made you cry, tears and everything? This is actually from me, I think, which is a bit random, but I was curious to hear your answer.
I struggled slightly. I'm not... I feel like I probably do cry perfectly easily at books, but I'm not sure I remember it, you know? That's not something I really retain. I did think The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger reliably will make me cry every time. I love that book. And then I was thinking, because I'm looking at my childhood pile, Watership Down, which I did reread recently to my children. That makes me cry. I had to suppress sobs in the final scene. They were dry-eyed. I don't think they found it particularly upsetting. And I was trying to think if Shuggy Bane made me cry. I think it might have done. I think it probably did, but I don't remember. How about you?
I have a very, very vivid memory of crying to this book. And it was in the wee hours of the morning in my old home in North Vancouver. I think I might have been at university, but maybe living at home for the summer. So maybe like 19 or so. And I remember sobbing. Like I was staying up too late because it was such a gripping read. And I just remember sobbing. I can't exactly remember why, but looking back at this book, having given you that tantalizing teaser.
What was it?
The Red Tent by Anita Diamant.
I've never even heard.
You ever come across that?
Nope.
Oh, no. Okay. So it was a New York Times bestseller. I'm looking at a copy online which says the 20th anniversary edition. So it obviously had enough attention at the time that it was worthy of this reissue at 20 years. It's basically biblical times. It's about Dinah, whose life in the Bible is only hinted at in a brief, violent detour within the more familiar chapters of the book of Genesis that tell of her father Jacob and his 12 sons. And it's essentially about what it's like to be a woman at this time. And the Red Tent is where women are sequestered, I think, when they have their periods or when they're about to give birth. I'm pretty sure I was probably sobbing over a birth sequence or the loss of a child or something gruesome and brutal that happens to women, which is still quite gruesome and brutal now, but can you imagine in biblical times?
Yeah.
It's not a book I'd want to reread, but yeah, I remember it really sucker punched me. And I'd be curious to hear from listeners, hey, if you do any shout outs to us, if you read that and it made an impact on you.
Wow. Yeah, I will never read that.
What? It doesn't sound good? Not to your taste?
Sounds like something I would run a mile from. Although, it's the sort of thing, book club did it. I'd have to. And I'd probably end up loving it. What was a book that made you laugh out loud?
We've talked about this in the past, haven't we?
It's quite hard.
Because I think you were saying, yeah, books don't really make you laugh out loud.
Only because I think the element of surprise is so important. And it's hard to be surprised by a book because you sort of tend to see everything coming. So then it's all the more remarkable when you do come across something that makes you laugh out loud.
What came to mind for me is The Idiot by Aleph Batiman.
Oh yeah, that is funny.
We've definitely discussed it on the pod, but
yeah,
was
I think
that
we did it on a bookshelf
episode?
We did it on a bookshelf.
Okay. And that made me laugh out loud because the main character of that book, Celine, is in her freshman year at Harvard and she's utterly clueless. And there was just so much recognition of her plight and her thoughts. And it just reminded me of my own years in university. And I just found myself laughing out loud.
Yeah, it's very relatable, that book. Except that she's sort of clever and brilliant in a way that I could never be. But apart from that, I jotted down, Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason, which I just read, which is the sort of current buzz book. Not sure, perhaps it's doing the rounds in the same way in Canada. I don't know if it's come out there yet. But it's the book that everyone's reading and talking about right now. And it's a book about mental health and deals with some quite dark and difficult themes, but it's hilarious. It's so funny. The observational comedy is absolutely brilliant and not like anything I've read before. And I think that's why a lot of people are kind of talking about having a real book hangover after you finish it, because it's not a particularly sort of unusual or remarkable voice, but it's just very distinct. It's very particular to the way that this author has written this book. And when you leave it, you kind of miss it. I also read a book, actually not so long after I read Them Off in the Mountain, called The Ascent of Rum Doodle, which was recommended by the folk at the Book Hive, which is a wonderful little independent bookshop in Norwich. They had been talking about it on their Instagram, and I just never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it, so idly I ordered it off them. It's a really brilliant little gem of a book. It's a parody of these classic epic tales of manly daring do, men going off to conquer Everest or the Arctic or the Antarctic or whatever. I mean, in this case, it's a mountain. And there's a lovely introduction by Bill Bryson. It's almost worth it for the introduction alone, actually, because he talks about how he came to the book and discovered it. And there's a lovely little history of the author who knew the book was successful in his lifetime, but I don't think he knew it would go on to become such a quiet cult classic. The thing about it is, parody, it tends not to work over a long period of time. And that the brilliant thing about this book is that it's so well done It works throughout the whole book. He never drops the ball. But the other thing I think that is really wonderful about it is, although these characters are set up as being risible characters, you know, you're not really supposed to like them, but there is a kind of underlying sweetness and kindness to the way that they behave. That is what comes through the book, particularly the main character. That's the thing that you really respond to and warm to. And so it ends up being very kind of sweet, heartwarming book, even as it's sort of sending up this whole genre of literature about men going off to see how dead they could get, conquering things. And the book I'm reading right now, I'm reading a book called Happy All the Time by Laurie Colwyn. It's, I think, it's been reissued by Weidenfeld and Nicholson as part of their Essentials series. It was recommended to me by Chrissy Ryan at Book Bar and also Elizabeth Morris, who was on the show recently. Both of them said it was great. I had never heard of it. It's a kind of romantic comedy. It is very funny. Not laugh out loud so far, but it's one of those books where it just keeps making you smile. And what I love about this, and it's quite different to other things I've read, is that the comedy is cumulative. So it's funny from the beginning, but the more you read, the funnier it becomes because it refers back to itself all the time. And the jokes just sort of build in a very subtle way that's really brilliant. I'm absolutely loving it.
That's really interesting.
So
that reminds me of like a good television sitcom, right?
Yes.
Things just build and build and build.
As you get to know the characters.
Punchline.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really
cool.
good.
I saw that on Instagram and was like, oh, that sounds like a good summer read. What was a book that kept you up into the wee hours of the morning? I can take the lead on this one. You mentioned Sally Rooney earlier and a bit of a disagreement.
Did that keep you up late?
It did. Yep, did it. Normal People. It kept me up late. I mean, so many books have kept me up late in my life. I've kind of grown out of staying up late to read, well, especially now that I have a daughter. But I will still get into the bad habit if my husband isn't home. It's almost like I need someone to be like, you need to turn off the light. Like, just stop reading. But yeah, Normal People. Loved it. Found it very moving.
Those Ferrante books, I was thinking.
Nope.
Oh, no, they didn't do it for you, did they? That's right.
No, they didn't.
But definitely up into the small hours with those ones. That Meg Mason book, Sorrow and Bliss, I was up until 1:30 a.m. reading. And then the next day, I just felt like death because I was so tired, but I didn't care because I'd finished it. The Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, who everyone knows now because of the, can't remember what the Netflix series was called, but it's Shadow and Bone was the novel.
Oh, yeah. That's why I recognize her name, Leigh Bardugo. Right.
Six of Crows, Shadow and Bone. I can't remember what the TV series was called. It was brilliant anyway.
The TV series is Shadow and Bone. It combines the Six of Crows and the Grisha trilogies.
So I quite like her fantasy. I'd read a couple of her fantasy books and I quite liked them, but, you know, wasn't raving about them or anything like that. I didn't sort of seek out every book in the series, but I kind of like the couple of that I read. But then I read The Ninth House, which is set in the real world, but it has this fantasy element to it. It's set in the world of secret societies at Yale, these houses, and she just brilliantly gives them all this very plausible magical backstory. And it turns out it took a while to get into it. At the beginning, I really didn't like it, and I was like, oh, I don't understand. This is just confusing and weird, but I kept on reading it and I got so drawn in, and oh my goodness, that is just such a build of a book. You just can't wait to find out how it all pans out. So I really recommend that. It was absolutely brilliant. I loved it. I really loved it.
Our next question comes from filtered_Louise, presumably that her name is Louise on Instagram. And she asks, what was the last book you wanted to go buy for absolutely everyone?
I tend not to buy books for people, mainly because I actually don't really like being given books very much. You know, I have so much to read. If people give me things, I can't really quite cope with extra books. Especially if I'm not, 100% convinced that it's something I'm going to love. If I choose something for myself, I have a reason why I want to read it, or it's a book club book and I kind of have to read it. But yes, I can't really factor in gift book. It's very rare that someone gives me something and I will just sit down and read it, which is a real shame because people generally give you books that they really love and they really want you to read. It's not unheard of, but I have an awful lot of books on my TBR pile that are just things that people have given me. But if I ever do have to buy a present for anyone, conversely, and kind of hypocritically, I suppose, I buy them books because that just makes the present buying experience really nice for me. And I do really think there is always a book for someone, and that's really pleasing. When you go in and you know what someone's like, you can always find something. And I don't mind if they don't read them or not. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. For me, it's about the fun of having chosen it for them.
Yeah, I share your resistance. Well, not quite that short. Resentment. Maybe resentment is too strong a word. But like you, I don't always love receiving books as a gift, and yet I will give them. But if we were to shift this question, just cheat a little bit, and it was, what book do you recommend to everyone? I had that experience recently when I read Miss Iceland by Udur Eva Olafsdottir. I'm saying that wrong, but she is an Icelandic author. We talked about this book a few episodes back on Bookshelf. And I just adored it. It's called Miss Iceland, and it's about a young female writer in Iceland in the early 1960s. And everywhere else in the world, things are beginning to shake up a little bit. In Reykjavik, she has to hide the fact that she writes at all. And it's her story, and it's her best friend's story, one of whom is a young gay man having a terrible time of it. And the other is young mother also having a pretty terrible time of it. And it sounds really gloomy, but it's not. It's so great. And I recommended it to a huge number of people, one of whom took me up on it, our friend Andy, who's in your book club. And he said it was great. And I was like, yes. I love that feeling when you recommend a book to someone and they are like, yeah, no, that does sound right up my street. And they read it and let you know they really enjoyed it. I think that's the best feeling in the world.
My sister-in-law did recently give me a book that I read and really loved. So it's possible, it is possible to have that experience. It was very short.
You have to know the reader.
She's the kind of person, she wouldn't ever want to burden anyone with a long book, and she chose this book that was very short and very good.
Next question from Ishini. Kills Joy again, lovely Ishini, on Instagram. What's the best memoir you've ever read? This one's tricky.
Yeah, I was trying to think, because I do read a lot of nonfiction, and I like a memoir or a biography, but then of course you can't think of one that obviously sticks in your mind. I mean, I love the one that I read recently, Deirdre Bair's book about writing about Simone de Beauvoir and Beckett in Paris. That was a brilliant memoir. But then I was looking on my shelves and I thought, well, okay, non-fiction, what's the best non-fiction? And my eye fell on a book that I do truly love, which is called The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century by the New Yorker writer Alex Ross. It's quite a big, thick doorstep of a book, but do not be put off because it's so brilliantly written. It's incredibly compulsive. He's looking at the history of the 20th century through its composers and the music that they wrote. And of course, they're all fabulously eccentric and had extraordinary, interesting lives. And it's very much a story of our times as well, story of the 20th century. And the way he writes about music, I haven't actually checked, but I'm virtually 100% certain if you looked it up on Spotify, I'm sure there would be a playlist with every single reference and you'd be able to listen to it. But I found I didn't need to listen to the music because the way he describes the music is so good. Sometimes you half remember things, you're vaguely familiar with things, but the rest of the time it's almost like you don't need to be because he writes so beautifully and descriptively about music, and I thought that was really wonderful. So that is a book I would love to reread, actually. It's one of those books where I've forgotten it now, and I'd love to go back and rediscover it all over again. It's really, really, really good.
It sounds good. I was saying this is a tough one, and then I realised that I do have a favourite memoir. It was my favourite book of 2020.
Oh. West with the Night.
West with the Night by Beryl Markham, who was the English Kenyan aviatrix, adventurer, racehorse trainer, and author. Just looking at her Wikipedia page, I loved that book. I talk about it at great length in other episodes, but essentially she just had such an incredible life. And one of the reasons I love that book too, though many might find it frustrating, is that she doesn't talk about her personal life. It's really, the focus is on her flying and her training of horses and her upbringing, running wild without parental supervision in Kenya. That real spirit of the 1930s, right? Which Maurice Wilson was channeling. So very inspirational. A random one to throw in, a memoir that had a huge impact on me, would be Michael Crichton's Travels. Thinking back to books you read when you were probably too young to read them. I think I read that when I was about 12.
Michael Crichton, like Jurassic Park.
Jurassic Park, Sphere, ER. Yeah, it's his memoir, and it begins with him in med school because he was training to be a doctor.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, hence, unless I'm misremembering this, ER, came from him.
Right.
Or came from one of his books. And then he obviously became a writer, but an extensive traveler. And he gets up to quite a few questionable things and questionable places. I seem to remember in Bangkok, and you can just imagine this 12-year-old being like, oh my goodness. And then he got a bit like new age weird, and there's a whole chapter about bending spoons in the Arizona desert. And I remember trying to bend spoons. I don't know. I think memoirs, they can mean so much to you because it's like, it's an exemplar of a life, isn't it? It kind of blows your mind. And if you read it at the right moment, yeah, it kind of shapes what you expect for yourself. Is that our last question? I have a question. I've got one. What is your favorite episode of the 100 that we've recorded?
Oh, they're all my favourites. They're like my children.
Oh,
no, I honestly mean that. Hand on heart.
Really?
I can listen to any one of them. You know, they're all made with love and care, and I listen to them about 1,000 times before I publish them, and I would happily go back and listen to anyone. You know, I just like listening to your voice, Laura, and the various people we have on.
We should say thank you to all the people who we have interviewed over the last few years. Good friends of the pod, like Phil and Sarah and Elizabeth, who've joined us for discussions, among others.
Our book clubs who very kindly and unresentfully, I think, don't mind being, you know, like half the show is about what they think. I think that's what makes it so much more interesting. So yeah, thanks to them.
Thanks to you for keeping the momentum up.
And I
allowing me to drop in and chat.
You know, going back to the promotion thing, it's very easy to get caught up in a kind of, you know,
capitalistic
mental loop. Yes, a sort of slightly negative feedback loop internally about, oh, no one's listening and only 3 people listen to this. And my husband always says, you know what? It's irrelevant. I mean, you know, his stuff goes out on national television and hundreds of thousands of people watch it. I feel like it's easy for someone with that kind of platform to say, wait, it's irrelevant about your listening numbers. I think it's actually quite reasonable and valid to say I quite like a few more. But equally, I do take his core point, which I think is true, and I do believe, which is that it's about making the best program that you can and feeling like it has a reason to exist and that it's hopefully going to make people smile or make people laugh or give them some new suggestions for things to read or just entertain them for half an hour or whatever, to try and do that as well as you possibly can, and that it's its own reward when you do that. And that's how I feel about all the shows. I just think in and of themselves, they're like little books sitting on a shelf just waiting for someone to come and discover them, and I think they're all of them good. You could dip into any single one and I think you'd have a nice time listening to it.
And maybe that leads us to a final thank you, which would be thank you to our listeners, whether you've just joined us today or you've been along for the ride. Thank you.
You might not know how much you mean to us, but sometimes one or other of you will email and we get so excited.
We respond as well.
I was just so happy to know that people are out there and listening to it. It's just really like thrilling, you know. It stops being just a conversation between Laura and me and becomes something else, which is just brilliant. That's nearly it for this episode.
If you enjoyed the show, check out our website where you can find our archive of episodes and full show notes of all the books we've discussed, from reviews to recommendations. You can also check out our library of articles.
You'll find it all at thebookclubreview.co.uk, where you can also sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter, which comes out on Sundays and is full of bookish inspiration. If you're keen to know what we get up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at bookclubrvwpod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. What's a book from childhood that you love? What's a book that makes you laugh or makes you cry? Drop us a line and let us know. We love to hear your book recommendations.
If you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate and review the show. It helps other listeners find us.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.
Right, Zoom number 1. This is a test for Zoom number 1. Press pause, record. I'm Kate, I'm Laura, I'm Kate, and I'm Laura. I'm Kate, I'm Laura, I'm Kate, and I'm Laura. Is this mono or is this stereo?
This is mono stereo. Hello, I'm mono stereo. And I like Cheerios. Mono stereo. Cheerios.